A solid understanding of pre-flop play is crucial for any player. Remember, most of your hands are going to be won or lost before the flop even comes down. You really need to learn how to use position to your advantage, which hands to play, and definitely which hands to get away from. Master pre-flop, and you're in the game.
Action's on Phil. Ivey takes it down with a pre-flop 4-bet.
Position in Hold'em is one of the most important aspects of the game because it dictates who has to act first and who gets to act last. If you're seated to the right of the button or on the button, you are in late position and you get to act last. If you're seated to the left of the button, you're in early position and you have to act first. Since the game is played in clockwise order, usually the player to your left has position on you, while you have position on the player to your right. The rare exceptions are when you and your opponent is seated on the button or in the blinds. Everything becomes more simplified when you are in position because you gain valuable information by seeing how the opponents in front of you play their hands. If you watch the better players, usually they're acting in position. Okay, so they're 3-betting, they're isolating with position. A lot of times you can have a worse hand, but you can have position, and that will give you the advantage in the pot. And that's because they have to act first. Say, you have a hand like 10-9, and they have a hand like Ace-10, okay? And the flop comes Queen 8-3, and they check. Now you bet. It becomes very difficult for them to play because, standard for them to do is when they act first, it's a check. Now they don't have no choice but to fold. And now you end up winning the hand with the worst hand because you have position on the hand. So I think that's a pretty clear example of how position matters. Out of position is a lot more trickier than playing in position. It's much more delicate of a situation. So you just need to be a lot more careful. I think you need to have a much stronger hand when you call re-raises out of position. You need to know when to 4-bet if your hand's not as good or if your hand's stronger than them, if you think they're going to continue playing. For example, under the gun in a 9-handed game, I guess I would open Ace-Queen. I would open 2 8s or above, 2 7s maybe, sometimes depending upon, the players. Usually I like to look around the table and see who looks at their cards first and see if I get some sort of read off of whether they're interested in their hand or not. I do that sometimes. But yeah, I play pretty snug under the gun because I think position is very important. It's a lot more important than people think it is. Most players have a set of guidelines of what hands are going to open from what position. I think a lot of that is mostly player dependent against the players that I'm playing against. I think what happens is you become too much like a machine when you do that. When you have okay, well, I'm just not going to open this hand, but I want to open this hand. This is where I want to stop. I want to open King 8 suited, but I'm not going to open King 7 suited. That's my guideline. I think it depends a lot on who's in the big blind, who's in the little blind, how much your opponents are 3-betting you, how much your opponents are flat calling you. So I think a lot of it depends on the players you're playing against. So that's why I don't like to have guidelines when I sit down and play. I just see my hand and make a decision. But I'm opposite from a lot of players. A lot of players group together what they're going to play from an exact position. They have everything kind of laid out in their mind. I don't do that. I just play. But when you're teaching someone, it's good to have these guidelines. It's good for them to have charts if they're just starting out. It's good for them to have charts to know, to what hands to play from certain positions. But then again, they got to keep in mind, they make these guidelines against players who play similar to them. So you need to be careful with these guidelines based off the players you're playing against. I know I keep repeating myself, but it's really important. The reason you can play weaker hands out of the big blind is because you already have money in there, for one. So you already have money invested. It depends on the player who opened the pot, whether you play weaker hands against him. But the main reason is because you have money already invested in the pot. You're getting pot odds on your call, but that's just not an excuse to play a weaker hand. That's just not enough reason to play a weaker hand. You have to think about what position your opponent raised in. If he raised on a button, would he have a weaker hand? If a tight player raises up front, then your hand needs to be stronger to defend out of the big blind. So just because you're in a big blind doesn't give you an excuse to play like a really weak hand. If you look at these two charts side by side, you can see that the buttoning's openings range is much wider than the under the gun's opening range. Since the button is opening a weaker range and we have the pot odds, we can defend more hands even if we're slightly behind. But if we're defending against a tight under-the-gun raiser, the pot odds might not be enough to make up for the equity disadvantage. And if you want a more thorough discussion of pot odds, you can find that in the workbook. So defending the big blind versus tight range, I would rather have a hand like 5-4 suited other than ace-9 or jack-10, because 5-4 suited plays a lot better versus a hand like ace-9 or jack-10, because ace-9 or jack-10, those hands could be dominated. Being dominated means if you have ace-9 and your opponent has ace-king, and the flop comes, let's say, ace-10-7, now he has an ace with a bigger kicker than you, and what that means is that it's going to be very difficult for you to win if you both flop an ace, because he has an ace with a bigger kicker, and he's going to end up winning a big pot against you because it's very tough to fold top pair in that situation. So you need to be really careful with those hands, whether you defend or not, with those hands if you're playing against a player with a tight range. And 5-4 suited, you give yourself a chance to win a really big pot if you flop a straight or sometimes a flush, or you flop 3 5s or 3 4s. There's a good chance you're going to win like a huge pot. In all of these examples, the opponent has potentially flopped top pair, top kicker. So there's a really good chance that a lot of chips are going to be put into the pot. That makes it difficult for them to fold there. Plus, the strength of our hand is disguised. If you have a hand like ace-9 or jack-10, and you flop 3 aces or you flop 3 jacks, there's a good chance you could be beat with a jack with a better kicker or an ace with a better kicker. But if you flop 3 5s or 3 4s, you're probably going to have the best hand. So I would much rather have that hand just because of the way it plays deep versus a tight player's range. Hands like ace-9, ace-10, ace-jack, those type of hands you need to be really careful with. Because a lot of times people open ace-king, especially from early position. Any hand other than ace-king, there's a good chance you could be dominated with. That's why I said I prefer 5-4. It's very difficult to be dominated with that hand. The little blind is the worst position on the table. I think a lot of people call out of the little blind too much when you have to act first, and that gives you a big disadvantage. Another thing is when people open a button, they either 3-bet too much out of the little blind or they 3-bet too little. So there's really a fine line of playing a little blind. So I think it's probably the easiest position to make the most mistakes from. It depends on the big blind. If he's folding for a 3-bet, if he's re-raising me a lot, so there's a lot of things that come into equations. It's just not a direct answer. That's what makes poker such an amazing game, is that there's so many intangibles, so many things going on around you. And every day is different. Every day is different players, to where you have to make adjustments based off of things that are going on around you and the players you're playing against.
Phil Ivey off to the main stage. Quite a crowd building on the rail.
We were just talking about defending the blinds. Let's take a look at a hand where I defended 5 deuce of club in a tournament. Doc opened with ace-5 of heart, under the gun. I think we're playing 6-handed. I defended with 5 deuce of club, which is pretty loose, especially in a tournament where you're capped off with the amount of chips you have. I don't know how many big blinds I've had there, but probably not enough to defend with that hand. It's not like a huge mistake, actually, but it's a decent mistake, I would think, defending with that hand in a tournament, especially when the guys raise up, up front. 5 deuce of club is a little bit of a stretch.
So Ivey calls. We go heads up to the flop.
Ivey not in great shape before the flop.
I chose to defend the blind because basically I've gotten away with playing a lot more hands than everybody else in my entire career. If you think your decisions are better than the next player post-flop, you can play a lot wider range of hands. Defending the blinds there isn't as risky as it seems, especially with a hand like 5 deuce of club, because you are up against an upfront raiser. And I would say that's a much better hand to defend than, say, like king 10, king jack, because, my hand's live and I potentially can win a big pot. Again, this is a little bit of a stretch. I would say, especially in a tournament, I would fold this hand if an opponent raised under the gun with the chip counts at the time. But, you know, like, let's say the button folded around to the button and the button raised, and I would defend his hand. But because the guy was under the gun, I think it's a little bit of a stretch. And I think it's a mistake where, you know, if you lose all your chips, you're just out. Just because we weren't playing really deep, meaning, when I say deep, meaning the amount of blinds you actually have, and it matters, you know, you holding on to your chips. So I think it's a mistake in a tournament, but not in, say, a cash game where everyone's super deep. In that exact situation, I would lean towards folding, and I would recommend to the players out there to probably fold that hand. But, you know, I would defend 5-4 a club, and I probably would defend 5-3 a club as well. But I think 5 deuce is just right at the cutoff where you probably should just pass and just move on.
Ace 5-3, top 2 for Doc Sands. Ivey with a pair of 5s and a gut shot.
And that's actually kind of hitting this flop hard for this kind of hand.
He checks to the razor. Sands continues for 64,000.
Ivey's gonna have no problem calling. Pair, gut shot, backdoor clubs, sweet.
Pretty decent flop. You know, I flopped a pair and a gut shot. A gut shot meaning if I catch a 4, I make a straight. If I make 5s and deuces, I probably have the best hand. I mean, I didn't know he had aces and 5s. You know, he flopped an amazing flop. I have a backdoor flush draw. So he continued betting. I called, pretty standard at this point.
He calls. The turn is the 6 of clubs, additional equity for Ivey.
And that turn card is just awesome sauce for Ivey. Sands 2 pair still best. He's happy to keep betting for value.
Ivey has checked a second time. And Doc Sands will bet a second time, 177,000.
Now, Ivey can either choose to semi-bluff raise or just call with a pretty disguised hand. You're more likely to see Phil Ivey use a coupon than fold in this spot.
He's picked up his cards. Pump fake. Ivey cutting out raising chips.
Here we go.
He makes it 527,000 total.
I think this semi-bluff might work against any decent single ace.
It's pretty standard there calling. I end up raising because it's pretty easy for me to have a set there. And I think it's very difficult for him to move in at this point, for him to move all in. He may fold some aces once in a while because I really don't play like this normally, and he knows that. Again, if he has aces and 5s, you know, I don't know he has that hand. I thought I'd take a shot there and try to win the pot right there. A lot of times in tournaments, you know, people do make big folds. So, you know, again, you do have to, you know, have some bluffs in some spots. So I end up raising him, hoping that, you know, I get him off of some hands, like maybe he had like a hand like ace-10, ace-jack, maybe he'll make a big fold. Or if he did have kings or queens or jacks or something like that, and he's betting for value, thinking I have a flush draw, maybe I'll give him a fold there. It also protects my ranges. Maybe it's a lot. I'm going to raise all sets. It's difficult to have a set, of course, but I'm going to raise all my sets on the turn there. And again, like if he does have a hand like ace-king, ace-queen, ace-jack, it's difficult for him to shove. He may call me, but I don't think he's going to shove there at that point. So I raised, and I thought, you know, maybe there's some chance he has like a hand like 7-8 of diamond, 7-9 of diamond. You know, he opens a lot of hands. You see, he opened with ace-5 of heart under the gun, so he would open with 7-8 of diamond, you know, under the gun as well. So my thinking was, if he did have a hand like ace-5 or something like that, I didn't think he would just move in, which he ended up moving in. I thought he would just call and, like, you know, see what I did on the river. Again, you know, maybe I didn't really calculate the amount of chips I had. He probably ended up playing the hand perfectly.
This is a weird spot for Doc. He's not beating any value hands, since Phil's probably not even going to raise a worse 2 pair in this spot. But there also really aren't a lot of value hands possible.
All in.
Sands shoves.
Now who's in a weird spot?
It'll cost Ivey everything he's got.
Wow, this is amazing. Phil Ivey, ladies and gentlemen, is in a spot.
When Sands shoved all in, it made the hand extremely difficult at that point. I never expected him to shove all in. Because again, if you have a hand like ace-jack or ace-queen, I think it's a pretty difficult shove with the way I play. I normally wouldn't raise flush draws in that spot with the chip count. So it appears as though I have a bigger hand than that. So when he moves in, it makes playing difficult. I didn't expect that. You know, I expected maybe a call at best. And again, I was expecting I was going to get some folds out of it. That's why I end up raising. When he moves all in, then I have to think, what are the chances that he maybe has a flush draw? Maybe my pair may be the best hand sometimes. Again, like shoving there with 7-8 of diamond, 7-8 of club, hands like that is a pretty reasonable play from him. Those are hands that he could have. Again, I have the 5, I have the deuce, so it's difficult for him to he could have ace and 6, ace and 5s. Yes, you could have those, but those are very unlikely hands that he has. So when he shoved, he either has a set. There's just 2 potential flush draws he could have. He either has a set or aces up. I didn't think he would shove with ace king, ace queen, ace jack. He could have, but I didn't think he would at the time. So he moved in. I thought, I had a good chance to maybe hit my flush draw or make a straight. And there's some chance that he may be moving in with the worst hand. So that's why I ended up calling.
Now, Phil thinks all of his perceived outs are live. He absolutely has to make this call. We know his deuce and 5 outs are dirty, which means he has to make his flush or a gut shot, which also won't always be good. Phil Ivey is kerfuffled. I think he's certainly regretting that check raise now. Doc's got to know he's ahead, but I don't know if that means he can relax or that he wants a call. Even knowing what the cards are, Phil's actually getting good enough odds to call, but the variance in this spot is massive. It doesn't matter what chips he counts out, it is all in to call.
This is the biggest pot of the tournament so far.
He's thinking about how this never would have flown in 2006.
Guess you could have that, maybe. And I'm not in that bad shape, but there's no way you have that. This one's funny. This one is funny.
Phil Ivey's been spending too much time with Daniel Negreanu.
Okay.
Surprising to see Ivey squirm like this. Surprising he didn't actually have a plan of what he'd do if Doc Sands came over the top of his check raise.
All right, okay, I'll call.
Ivey's gonna go for it.
Gulp.
5s and deuces no good. He needs a club or a 4 on the river.
So stupid I am.
Now he's been spending too much time with Yoda.
A hand like 5 deuce of club, it's difficult to play against a really good player. If you're playing against bad players, I would say I'm more likely to defend that hand. But again, these are, really good players I'm playing against. You need to be a lot more fundamentally sound when you're playing against, tougher players. With these hands, you can end up in situations like this. Hey, I could have made a club, I could have made a straight, I could end up winning that hand. But you don't really want to look at results. You want to look at, what's right and what's wrong and try to make the best possible decisions you can at the time. And looking back at this hand now, I see that, defending with 5 deuce of club was a bit of a stretch. So, I took a risk and I ended up in a bad spot, but, I still had 27% to win the hand. And, you win those hands sometimes. And, sometimes mistakes pay off, but you don't want to get in the habit of making mistakes. You want to make less mistakes than your opponent. That's what poker's all about.
Ivey does have 12 outs, which means he's going to hit a little more than 1 out of every 4 times.
It's a 6 on the river. We lose Phil Ivey.
Yeah, Phil. Thanks.
This time the Doc does take out the Ivy.
I think this is just a classic example of me becoming a little bit impatient, not waiting for a better hand. I looked down and saw a suited hand and just decided to defend. Usually it takes a hand like this for me to lose all my stack. A lot of the situation had to be perfect, and I end up making maybe a mistake on the turn by raising. So, I just added my pre-flop mistake, and then I made a pretty big mistake on the turn that ended up costing me the entire tournament. One of my biggest mistakes is I really just play. I don't really have, a set strategy when I play, and that was probably a little bit too wide of a range to call with from out of the big blind at that point. But I've gotten away with it basically my whole career, but the players have become tougher now, so you really can't, you have to really monitor that, and I kind of took that out of my game over the last couple of years. This was a while ago.
Ivey heads to the rail.
Phil goes from 1.4 million to out in 14th. Nobody saw that coming.